Welcome to episode 37 of the Empowering Ability Podcast.
Welcome to the Empowering Ability Podcast, where we get you and your loved ones impacted by disability the information needed to live a full and meaningful life. Now here's your host, Eric Gall.
Welcome, folks. Today I bring you a podcast with a very engaging guest, Patti Scott. Now, you may have heard Patti's name be mentioned by her husband, David Hasbury, from episode 35, where Dave and I talk about placement and coverage and the history of the disability sector and how we got to where we are today. And Dave mentions the great work that Patti's done and really thinking differently about providing support to people with developmental disabilities. So Patti has worked for more than 30 years with people that have disabilities, and she co-founded an organization called Neighbours Inc. And it's a really innovative organization, and I won't explain too much about it now because Patti does a much better job of doing that in the podcast. And she'll talk about why she created Neighbours and really the core values that Neighbours holds to help people to live the lives that they truly want to live. So it's a really engaging and inspiring conversation with Patti, and I hope it helps you think a little bit differently about your loved one that might have a disability or people that you or your organization support. So here's Patti. Hey, Patti, welcome to the Empowering Ability Podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited about doing this.
My pleasure. I'm excited to have you on as a guest. So, Patti, maybe we could just start off by you telling us a little bit about yourself and the organization that you lead, Neighbours.
Okay. Well, I've been doing this for, about 35 years now. And I started out in the early 80s supporting people with disabilities. And it was the beginning of deinstitutionalization in the state of New Jersey, and was working in group homes and doing things along those lines. And over the course of time, that just wasn't feeling very right to me. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And I can get into that more after I do, the introduction part. But in 1995, for many reasons, I decided to start an organization called Neighbours. And Neighbours was and is all about supporting people in a very individualized way to live a full life in the community of their choosing, and to have their own home, and to be in charge of what happens in their life, and to make a meaningful contribution to the world.
Yeah, that's awesome. So there's a few questions that come to mind there, but I guess for you, you explained kind of how you worked in the disability sector, and you didn't necessarily like what you saw and along the way in some instances. So what really drove you to create an organization to do things a little bit differently?
Well, there were actually a whole bunch of things, but some of them were what I saw as the inequities in the way people were supported to live. So people had moved out of institutions and into very nice houses and very nice neighborhoods, but they were still living with the same people they had lived with in the institution. They may have been living with people that they didn't like when they were living in the institution. And in fact, the first group home I worked in, that was the case. These guys were living together and didn't like each other, and that just didn't make any sense to me. And they were going to day programs with other people who had moved from the same institution instead of having a job in the community, and they were riding a van that everybody who had moved out of the institutions all rode. And it was like there was this separate life that people were living. They were in a community, but they weren't part of a community. And in fact, their life, while it was in a much nicer house, didn't look much different than it had looked when they were in the institution. And the first group home I worked in, the neighbors and the community weren't even welcoming to the men who lived there. So not only was their life pretty much restricted to similar to what it had been in the institution, but they weren't even developing new relationships or getting connected within their community at all. So that was one part of it, that it didn't seem like a kind of life that you could pay me to want to live. A second piece was that I was working there, and the other people who were working there and the people who ran the organization, we all really wanted to do good things for people, and we worked really hard, and we really, our commitment was to support people to have a life that was full and rich and meaningful. And it seemed to me that the reason that it wasn't happening wasn't because of the work we were doing. And in thinking about it over time, it struck me that it had to be about the way that the supports for people were designed. Like, you could have the nicest people doing the hardest work, but if they were doing it in the wrong setting, it's not going to make any difference. It's sort of like you could have made the Titanic look really gorgeous and upgraded everything and put new curtains and new deck chairs and had the best menu. And if the boat went down, it's not going to matter. You know, there's a more global structural issue.
Mm-hmm.
So it seemed like the way we were supporting people needed to be designed differently. And the ultimate thing came for me in 1995, right before I started the organization, when someone that I cared about very much and was trying to support, who had been in a temporary respite kind of setting because she had tried to hurt herself, developed some real dreams for what she wanted for her life. And we would have been able to support her to pursue those dreams. They didn't cost any more money. We had organized it. We had set it up. We had figured out how to make it happen. And ultimately, she wasn't able to, because the system that was providing these group homes, these kind of segregated group home type settings, they had openings and vacancies, and she needed to move into one of those vacancies. And it was a real eye-opener for me. At the time, I was co-executive director at the organization I was working for, a really good organization. And I realized that instead of supporting people to live life the way they wanted to, the kind of supports we were providing were keeping people from living the life they wanted to live. So instead of being someone who was helping people to move in the direction that they wanted to go, the structure of the work we were doing was actually hindering that. And I just didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to start something over from scratch that could be structured and designed in a way that could really support people in a way that I wanted to be supported, that could help people to have a life that gave them the same kind of opportunities that I want for myself and for the people that I love.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I mean, what you're saying really resonates. I think so many people have those positive intentions, but if you're working in a model or a system that's not designed to meet the needs of the individual, you're set up for failure. It's very difficult to meet those needs if the system's not designed in a way that enables people to support in that manner. And I like your analogy about the Titanic, right? Doesn't matter what you do, but it's still going to go to the bottom. Yeah,
and I think I do think for myself, there was just something about needing to take some personal responsibility. You know, I liked where I worked, and they were good people and trying to do good things, and they were very supportive of me. But if it's not the work that kind of resonates in my own heart with what I want to be doing, I felt I needed to do something about that, or I was part of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I admire you for taking that step, and then another step and getting to where you are now. So I'm curious, when you kind of looked at what you were doing and had that white blank canvas, did you start with certain principles when designing Neighbours, or what did that look like?
Well, there were a couple of general things that we believed. And then there were some basic values that were underneath it. So, and they kind of, there's some overlap between them. So some of the general things that we believe is, number one, that people should be in control, that the agency shouldn't be in control. People should have control over their own life, their supports, their services, their homes. and that they should have whatever support and help they need to make that work for them, but they should be the ones in control, they and the people they love and who love them. So that's a dramatic shift in the way the service provision system works, certainly in the mid-90s, because it's back at that point in time, and in many places it's true at this point in time and as well, but especially back at that point in time, essentially people were served by agencies. Agencies would get the money. They would figure out what kind of program a person would move into, and the person didn't have much choice or control. And in fact, if they weren't happy where they were living, they could ultimately choose to leave, but the money would stay with the organization. So it's not like they could go anywhere differently. So we wanted to make sure people had that kind of control in their life. We wanted to be very clear that we were working for the person, that they were essentially our boss. And if they ever did decide to leave, they could take their money and they could go, and we would take the money out of our agency contract because it's their money, it's their resource, and support them to be supported elsewhere if that's what they wanted to do. And we also really thought about the fact that we didn't want people to be dependent on the developmental disability system, because being dependent on the system makes you a client of a system instead of a citizen of a community. If we wanted to support people to be citizens, they needed to not be 100% dependent on funding of whatever the local disability agency is. So we decided that really early that we would need to invest in looking at other resources for people and thinking in different ways about how to support people to have the kind of life they wanted to have. And there's almost no one that we work for in providing these individualized supports, even now, 20 some odd years later, that is reliant wholly on funding from government systems. We've supported and developed other ways for people to have resources, both people resources and social resources and community resources and other kind of funding opportunities for people who are poor or other things that they might be eligible to have access to, so people's lives are not just dependent on the system. So those were some of the basic thoughts in our head when we got started. And the basic values that we believed in, if I had to summarize them, that there's probably 5 things that we think are really important for people to have a good life. And we call it an investment framework because we think if you invest in these areas of life with people, that you can support people to develop a meaningful life. And by investing, it means we put a lot of time and energy into these areas, especially up front, because what we see happening over time is that as these areas grow, you don't have to invest as much. And that's because the investment starts to build into, an asset. A person has an asset in that area. So I'll give some examples of that. But the 5 areas of the investment framework are first, that people, their lives and their support should be built upon their dreams and their vision for their life. So instead of developing a program and someone can either fit into it or not fit into it, you listen deeply to somebody, you get to know them, and then you help them design a life based upon what's important to them. And there's a whole host of things that I think are really important about this. I could probably spend a morning talking about them. But in brief, a lot of the people that we worked for, especially in the beginning, but still true to this day, had not had a lot of life experience. We helped a lot of people who are moving out of institutions who may have been there for, 40, 50 years. And so to talk to those folks about what's important to you and what do you want out of life, and if you could live life the way you wanted it to, and if you could live where you wanted to live, what would that be? It's really hard for somebody who hasn't been beyond the gates of an institution to know the answer to that. So that's one of the first things around this dream and this vision. If people haven't had that kind of experience, we need to support them to just explore and get to see the world and see what's possible. The second thing is people have often led pretty lonely, isolated lives with paid people coming in and out of their lives for years and years and years. And when we come in and enter into that, without knowing people very well, it takes a long time to build trust. And when there's no trust, people are not necessarily going to be open to sharing what's deeply important to them, what's really in their heart, what matters to them. And so this idea of helping people explore their dream, we're big believers in person-centered planning. In particular, we love using the tools of PATH and MAPS. But we believe helping someone explore their dreams is an ongoing process as you build trust with them and experience life with them. And the MAP or PATH is part of that process. But it's not a one meeting or one afternoon type of thing. It's over time, helping people explore what's important to them. And then finally, that's going to change as we grow. Our dreams are going to change. What we want for our life is going to change. We had one guy who moved and was so set on what he wanted. He came from an institution. He wanted to live near his mother and grandmother. He knew the apartment he wanted. He knew who he wanted to live with. This was the neighborhood he wanted. And he moved in there. And within 3 months, he wanted to move to another apartment. And 6 months later, he wanted to move to another apartment. And this went on with him for, a good couple of years. And now he's been in the same place for 12 or 13 years. But it took him a while to really explore different things in life and figure out what he wanted. And to me, that's actually pretty normal, because I think back to, when I was young, and that's pretty much what I did. I kind of moved around from place to place and found what I wanted and how I wanted to live and who I wanted to live with, and made that work for me. So as you help people explore those things and develop and clarify what their dreams and visions are, then you can design the supports that are going to work so people can live the way they want to live. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this whole idea that people should have control over their own life, and they should have the responsibility that goes along with that control. And of course, they should have as much help as they need for that to work. And so we set up a couple of things as an agency to make that work. And the first was that any money that we got to support a person was their money. It went into an individual budget for them, and they had authority over that budget. And this was in the days before individual budgets were happening. So it wasn't something that was, easily done, or there wasn't a mechanism for it. So yeah, we kind of created our own internal mechanism for individual budgets in the system that already existed where we were working. So that was one thing. People had authority over their own resources. They were the boss of their own staff, and we created our policies and procedures as an organization so that people were what they call here the managing employer, and that meant they could make all the decisions about their staff. They could decide who to hire, who to fire, what they pay them, what they do, if they want to give them a raise. And there were times that I had different points of view on who someone should hire than the person did. And it was always the person's choice and the person's decision, as long as, their staff person could legally be hired with the funds, with the government funds. So they, couldn't have committed any serious recent crime, and, they had to be over 18, those kind of things. Mm-hmm. And we believe that people should have control of their own home. That's another resource that we thought was incredibly important. And so we didn't buy or own any property. We supported people to rent their own properties. And sometimes that meant guaranteeing the rent in the beginning. One time I co-signed for somebody on a lease. But we supported people to rent their own places, and we supported people to buy their own homes. We accessed mortgage products that gave people low interest mortgages, and we accessed down payment funding, and we got to know how to do that. So a number of people bought their own homes. But we thought it was important that this is the person's home. And if they decide at some point they don't want us to work for them and they want their money to move somewhere else, then they stay in their home and we move on. Or if they don't want their staff anymore, then their staff goes, but they have their home and they have their base. And we just thought that was really important for people. So those were some of the things we built in structurally that we thought were important. And people, one of the things we learned is that people really got and loved the idea of being in control and managing their own resources and being the boss of their staff and having their own home. They didn't get as much right away the idea that meant you have to take some responsibility for the decisions you make. Like, you can't fire everybody on a Friday and expect that somebody's going to show up and do everything for you. Or you can't spend twice what your budget is and expect that somebody else is going to make up that money. So, part of our role was supporting people to think through those things. And I will say that the people we work for have been very responsible about that over time. And just like I was when I first started managing my own budget and my own apartment and my own life, they had a learning curve about what it meant to be responsible about that. So that's the second thing, that people should have control, and they should also have that responsibility that goes with it, and they should have the support that they need in order to make that work, because it could be a big job to manage. Most of the people we work for have 24/7 support, and it's a big job to try and manage all of that.
Yeah, and the metaphor that's coming to mind for me is I'm picturing an organizational chart for an organization, and I think typically an individual that has a developmental disability can almost fit into like a mid-level manager spot where people above them are making a lot of decisions for them and offering them different programming. And what you've done is you've given them a promotion up to CEO, and now they have that choice and control, and then they have kind of their support structure below them.
Yeah, I think it could certainly be described that way. And in fact, our organizational chart is like that. The people we work for on the top of the chart. And I think one of the things we did to support that is we made a commitment to people that as long as they choose us to work for them, we'll stick with them. Even if it gets difficult or challenging, as long as it's their choice, we'll stick with them for the rest of their life. So we have this kind of commitment to walk with people throughout life. And we have a role we wound up calling the advisor. We didn't start with this role, but within a couple of years we developed it. And that advisor is the person who supports the person in whatever way they need to manage their supports, and does a lot of the legwork for them, so that the person is free to live their life. Managing their supports doesn't have to be a full-time job, but they have this advisor who works for them and in partnership with them to make that happen.
So we have a question from one of our listeners, Patti, that I would love to ask you. Just let me get to it here. So this listener has a son or a daughter with a developmental disability. And they say it's wonderful to have a goal, to have person-directed initiatives based on an individual's desires. Where we have difficulty as a family is either in funding or time to encourage natural relationships. How can a family with very little resources in time and financials help to create such a vision for their child? Well,
some of the next pieces of the investment framework I'm going to talk about this answer will relate to that a little bit. But one of the things, we have worked with some kids who are in school. Most of the people we work with tend to be adults, but we have worked with people who are still in school and supported them in developing a network of people around them, supported them in figuring out, what they're good at, and supported them in developing their dreams for the future, helped them think about what their gifts are. And one of the things we found out is that the schools, at least where we are, really do support that for the person. If it fits into their IEP, it's part of the transition planning, and it can be part of what's going to happen as the student goes forward, particularly in the teenage years. But one of the things that I would suggest is doing something such as a map with the young person and the family. And that's a planning process where you put a piece of paper up on the wall and you explore the kind of the story of the young person, but also what's important to them and what their gifts are and how those gifts can be shared in community. And if you can get an afternoon where people come together, and you and the young person invite whoever is important to you to come and sit and be together for that afternoon, And you'll need to get some facilitators to come in and facilitate the map, some people who are familiar with the process. And if you just have that kind of conversation during the course of an afternoon and kind of start to figure out who this person is and what they have to offer, and where they might be able to offer it in the community, and you engage the people who are there, whether it be neighbors or some friends or some family, to start thinking about with the person and the parents, how we can start to make some of this stuff happen and how we can start to pursue this, and people who will actually, help the person to start expanding some of what's discussed in the meeting. I've seen some really wonderful things come out of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the power of those relationships. Is there anything on the financial side of things that comes to mind for you in terms of getting the financial resources to start to make some of these things happen and to support an individual to pursue their dreams and desires?
Well, it's an interesting question. There certainly are things here that we can help people to access. I'm not sure how well that's depending upon what country you're in. It's harder to say. But there are things in the States. You have to be an adult to access these, pretty much. But IDAs, they're called individual development accounts, and we run these for the people that we work for. And people can save money without it interfering with any of their benefits. And they can save up to $3,000 over a 3-year period. That's the program that we run. And at the end of that 3-year period, their dollars are matched times 3. So they walk away with $12,000. And people can save that for things like starting a small business, education beyond, high school, kind of college education or other training or vocational training. Or they can save it for putting a down payment on a home or things along those lines. So it's stuff that can, with some saving and the matched dollars, it can support people to develop an asset that they can actually use to do something that could actually, I don't want to say would be life-changing, but can shift their life. I mean, you get a college education or you get vocational training or you start a small business or buy a home, it can actually shift your life. You've developed an asset you didn't have before. The United States has legislation around something called an ABLE account that also allows you to start saving money when you're very young without it interfering with benefits. So there's things along those lines. And I think it's our job to find those things and help people connect with them and then even to develop the options like the IDA opportunity that we have within our organization to develop those for people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very cool. So were there other elements of your values and the investment framework that you wanted to talk to?
Yep, there's 3 more pieces of it. So we did the dreams and vision and basing supports on those. We did the responsibility and more important, the choice and control. The next one was really helping people figure out who they are and what they have to offer the world. What is the person's gifts? What is it that they're passionate about? What is it that they have to offer? How can they make a contribution and how can they make a difference? And for a lot of people, that's been about helping them see themselves differently and helping others see them differently. Because a lot of the people we work for have a whole host of labels attached to them that have absolutely nothing to do with gifts. So it's about helping people figure out what that might be. So, for instance, someone that we helped move out of an institution who had all kinds of labels as behaviorally challenging, and she would hurt people, and she'd pull people's hair and rip scalp out of their head, and all these kind of things, and that were attached to her, and it just really, it didn't help her to feel very good about herself, and people kept a large distance from her. We tried to look at what are the gifts and what is it she has to offer. And one of the gifts she had was that she was a tremendously welcoming person. Now, she didn't like to be enclosed in spaces and she didn't like to be, crowded in. But when she saw people, she would run up to them. She would remember everybody's names. She'd throw their her arms around them when she'd see them. She'd welcome them. It'd be, "Hi, Patti, I missed you. How are you? How's your mother?" She'd remember little details about you. She didn't have a lot of words or a lot of conversation, but whenever you saw her, you felt like, yeah, I feel good. I'm
You felt
happy
loved.
that I'm seeing her. Exactly. Yeah, I'm important. And we just thought that was a tremendous gift. And so we wanted to figure out a way that she could share that gift. And the place, and it took us 9 or 10 places till we found the right place. We tried some places that actually turned out to be wrong places for her to share that gift. But she started volunteering at a soup kitchen in downtown Trenton, which is our state capital in a pretty urban area. And it was just a perfect fit for her. She would dish up the food, and she did that several times a week. And whenever people would walk through the door, she knew most of them, and she'd run over and she'd give them a hug, and she'd tell them she missed them, and she'd ask how they were. And she knew if they had a son or a daughter or someone they were waiting to hear from, she would ask about that. And people loved her. And she brought real joy to people's lives. And in fact, a couple of years in, she won Volunteer of the Year award there was a big banquet, and she was honored at the banquet. And she found her place in the community where she could show up, where she could share her gift, and she could show up and make a valued contribution, where she became a regular at that place, and where she was seen as and wasn't just seen, she had a very valued role. And it led to a whole bunch of other valued roles for her. But it's finding that gift, helping people find their gifts, and then helping them figure out where they're going to share them. That's the third piece of what we thought was important. And the fourth piece was that whole idea of the finding where you're going to share them, finding the places in the community where that person can show up, and helping them develop a presence in their community so that they are known and valued and, seen as someone that is a real asset to that particular community. So one of the things we did to support that process of helping people find their own presence in community was we made a decision not to have offices. And for a long time, we had no office whatsoever. And then we got a place where we kept the files when they outgrew my garage. But what that meant is that when people interview their staff, when people do meetings with their staff or anything at all that goes on, it's out in the communities in which they live. And it means that our advisors and myself, that we do our work actually out in the communities where people live. And it helps us to get to know those communities. And it certainly helps people to be there in their communities and be seen as a person in the community. So, and the fifth thing that we thought was just critically important, and I think this is probably the most important of all, is that we support people to have meaningful relationships in their life and to develop a network of people in their life. I think good paid relationships are critical, and people and their staff, we have some staff who've worked for people now for 20 years, and they've developed these wonderful relationships. But beyond that, to have people who are not paid to be part of their life, to have friends and loved ones, and the people in our life that are important to us. I mean, at the end of your life, when you look back on it and think about what's important, it's typically the people you loved and the people who love you, and those times when you're able to make a difference in the world. And so many of the people that I've met who happen to have the label of a disability have a very, very small number of people in their lives who they love and who love them. And quite often, those people tend to be just family. And not that there's anything wrong with family. Family are the most important people in my life. But it's those other people, our very best friends, our closest friends, people who are with us throughout a lifetime, our acquaintances, the people we see when we volunteer at the soup kitchen, or when we walk around our neighborhood, or when we go to the local gym and that we chat with. It's all of those people that give our life meaning. And, I'm sad to say that many of the people that I've known over the past 35 years of doing this work, there hasn't been anybody. And many of the people I've known even didn't have family. They've been separated from their family at a very young age, or the person themselves was older and their family was gone. So we thought that was critically important for quality of life. And, also, and this is all data now. There's been studies on this, but loneliness kills more people than smoking. So if you want people to be healthy and if you want them to be safe, they need to have people who love them, keeping an eye on them. Mm-hmm. So those 5 things, we thought if our job was to support people and to build assets in those 5 areas of life, to develop their capacity and their ability to dream, to know what they want out of life, to keep dreaming bigger, to have control of their life and understand what that meant and make their own choices and kind of grow in their ability to do that, to figure out what their gifts were, and to share those gifts in community and to find places in community and become connected and be someone that's valued in their community, and to support people to, have relationships that are meaningful to them. And I'm not saying people have to know hundreds of people, but if we support people to have 2, 3, 4, 5 close friends, I feel good about that. And we think that that's where our work needs to focus on. So there's stuff we have to do so people keep getting their funding, and there's stuff we have to do so we can continue to be an organization, and there's a paperwork we have to complete and all of that kind of stuff. And, we do that, but that's not the focus of our work. That's the stuff we do so that we can be available to support people to have the kind of life they want to have.
Yeah, I love those values, and I think they're all so important, and they're all interconnected as well. Would you be able to share maybe a story of an individual that you support that reflects and shows those values in action?
Sure. I'll share one of my favorite stories of a woman who was really quite older when I met her. She was moving out of an institution when it was closing. She was 79 years old, and she had lived there for 50 years. And the institution, I'm really pleased that it did close, but she wasn't happy at the time that it was closing because I guess she had not known anything else. And I went to meet her as the beginning of when our organization was starting, and I would go down there and try and meet anybody that I thought might be interested in what we were going to do. And I didn't necessarily think she'd be interested in what we were going to do, but I knew from the information I had that she wasn't interested in anything else. So I thought I could offer her some options. And I went and talked to her, and she was just a beautiful woman. She had this long silver hair, and she was in her wheelchair, and she was hunched over, and she was in the hospital unit because she wasn't eating at the time. And I talked to her about the fact that she was moving, and I knew she wasn't happy, but if she would share her dreams with me, we could help her figure out, how she wanted to live, and she could live the life she wanted to live, and it could be wonderful. And even though she wasn't happy now, when she actually moved, it could be a great experience. And, I went on and on for quite a while, and I couldn't tell if she was listening or not because her head was all hunched over. And finally, she lifted her head up, and she looked me in the eye, and she told me to fuck off. And I thought, well, that's not exactly the reaction I was expecting. I thought she'd be thrilled to have somebody say this stuff to her. And I also thought, so if she's really going to be in control, she's made her point very clearly, and I should do what she says. So I left. But I couldn't leave it at that because I had these visions of her being forced to move and not wanting to go. And actually I had a dream one night where they were pulling her through the gates of the institution, and she was kind of clinging onto the pillar and refusing to go. And so I went back to see her again, and we had pretty much the same conversation. I said the same stuff, and she said the same stuff. And, I became determined to try and get to know her better. Even if she didn't want to move, I figured I could see if I could get to know her better. Or if she didn't want to move with us, because she was going to have to move one way or another. Mm-hmm. And so I went back to see her over time, and I brought her stuff. I brought her ice cream, and I brought her magazines, and I brought her videos, and I hoped we'd be able to make a connection in some way or another. But her response to me was the exact same words each time I went. And finally, one of the staff of the institution told me she liked some of the feral cats that were out back behind the unit she was staying in. And so I brought her a cat when I went to visit her. And she loved the cat. She named the cat Tommy. And once she loved the cat, she started to I wouldn't say love me, but she started to like me a little bit. And within a week or so, she came out with me for coffee. And we drove through the grounds of the institution, and she was in the car with me, and we had her wheelchair folded up in the trunk. And I remember thinking as we drove through the gates, and I knew this because in all the paperwork, she hadn't been off the grounds in 50 years, right? So this was 1996. Last time was 1946. So she hadn't seen, tons and tons of stuff. She hadn't seen streetlights and Starbucks and movie cinemas and strip malls and all the different things that are out there.
The world changes a lot in 50 years.
It does. So, how could she know what her dreams are for what life is going to be outside of the institution? So, as we drove around and she started to see things, I like to think it gave her some of a better idea of what could be. And we went out a number of times, and I think, she started to get, I wouldn't say fond of me, but she started to feel a little more comfortable with me. And on one of our trips out, she said to me that, it wasn't a lot of words, but she said, I want to live near my brothers, my older brothers, and when you think about that, she, from what I knew, she hadn't seen her family in years, 30, 40 years. She had lived with them till the time she moved into the institution. And when you think about how you hold that in your heart for all that time, that you want to be reunited with your older brothers, I mean, that's not something you're going to share with a stranger. I think the only reason she was willing to share that was because of the time we spent together. So we found her brothers. One had passed away just recently, and the other, who was in his 80s, was still around, and we helped her get a 2-bedroom apartment near where her brother lived, about a 5-minute drive away, which was about an hour and a half from the institution. She had 1 bedroom, and the second bedroom was for someone who was going to be a housemate and who would live with her and provide her with some support, because one of the deals we had made for people moving into their own home instead of living in a group residence was that it wouldn't cost any more money than what it would be if they lived in a group home. So we had to figure out some more creative ways of supporting people to make the finances work. So she had a live-in housemate who didn't pay rent but was available overnight in the morning when she first woke up. And it was great for the housemate, who was a nursing student and going to school and didn't have a lot of money. And the person we were working for was 80 by the time she moved. She went to sleep early at night, and it allowed the housemate Trudy time to study and do her thing. So it worked out really well. And her cat Tommy moved in with her. And the whole situation was a good situation for her. And she had originally thought she'd like to go to a senior citizen day program, but after being in her own home for a day, she had a big housewarming party, she decided she didn't want to. She wanted to retire. And at the age of 80, that was pretty reasonable. So we tried to find the things, the gifts that she had and the ways that she could become connected to the world. And it turned out she loved children. And she started doing babysitting for some of the young families on the street, and children loved her, and they would come over, and with the support of her staff, because she had staff with her all the time, with the support of her staff, she would do some babysitting for the families on the street, and she got to know her neighbors, and the young moms would invite her over, and she got to expand her network through doing that. She loved animals. She wound up getting a dog, and she also got a bird and fish and a rabbit, and she wasn't even supposed to have pets in her apartment. But when you're in your 80s, I guess your landlord looks the other way.
Reminds me of Ace Ventura, when his landlord comes, all the pets hide, and then they all come out.
Well, they didn't even hide. They would climb on him. It looked like he didn't even see them. He would look the other way. And she started, she got involved with the dog show circuit, where she would go to dog shows 2 or 3 times a week, and she got to know the people who brought their dogs to the dog shows. Her dog was not a show dog, and she hung out with the dogs, and that brought her a lot of joy, but she also hung out with the people, and she developed a whole network of people through the dog shows. And she made some other connections. A mother-in-law of one of the moms she hung out with would come over every Wednesday, and they do baking because she liked baked goods. And so the last 5 years of her life were lived with her sharing her gifts, her love for children and her love of dogs, her being engaged in her community, both in her neighborhood and holding this valued role as pretty much a grandmother in the neighborhood, and her having this wide network of people that she spent her time with. And when she passed away, the people that showed up was just amazing to me. All the neighbors and their families and some of their friends she had gotten to know, her brother and his kids and cousins and nieces and nephews and all these family people who she'd been spending time with for the past few years, and her friends from the dog show circuit. And so she went from, this life that was in the institution for a very long period of time to a life in a place that was hers with her name on the lease and staff that she chose, and a life in a neighborhood and a community that was actually meaningful to her.
Yeah, I love that story. And I love that she was 80 when she started doing this work. And I think that carries an important message that it's never really too late. Like, somebody that's 80 if you're able to support someone who's 80 to create a life of their own. You can do it at 60, you can do it at 50, 40, 30, 15, right? To start to think about that. So yeah, and I love how really those values that you carry within your organization come through. So Patti, such important information that you've shared today for all of our listeners, whether it be family, supporters, or leaders in the disability sector. Where can people go to learn more about the work that Neighbours do? And maybe how could they get in touch with you if they wanted to learn more and continue a conversation?
Okay, well, we have two websites, one for the service part of the organization where we work for people, and that's neighbours-inc.com. And we spell Neighbours the British way with a U in it, NEIGHBOURS. And then we have a second website for a second company that we have, which is Neighbours International, and that's neighbours-international.com. And that's an organization where we do more of education in other countries, other states, and, in other places around the world. So that's the second piece of what we do. And on that website, you'll find some stories in video and some writings that might be useful. And some of the videos in particular, most of them are 10, 12 minutes at the most. And there's some various stories of people. There's some leading thinkers, things like that people might find interesting. And people are more than welcome to email me directly, Patti Scott at neighbours-inc.com. And I spell my name with an I.
Perfect. I'll include all that information in the show notes as well as the blog that goes along with the podcast. And Patti, it's a pleasure having you on the podcast today. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
A big, big thank you goes out to Patti Scott for joining me on the podcast today. And I hope this podcast helped to give you a few different perspectives or look at things maybe a little bit differently or start to reframe things. And I hope it gave you an opportunity to think about the 5 values that Patti shares on the podcast. So really, her values, Neighbours' values of helping a person think about their dreams and find their vision, really having choice and control, helping people to figure out who they truly are and what they have to offer to the world. And then, finding their gifts and finding a place to share their gift. And then kind of the 5th and what Patti feels is the most important value is to help people to build meaningful relationships in their lives. So I hope that was really valuable for you to hear Patti speak about those things and tell some stories that really encompass those values. And I'd love for you just to think about maybe one of those values that would be most impactful in the life of someone that you love. And think about how can you support that person to move the yardsticks forward for that one specific value. And what are some things that you can do to help them build that asset for that one specific thing, whether that's relationships or whether that's helping them to create their dream and vision for their life or helping them to get more choice and control over their support And I look forward to sharing some more stories around stories around people that have really started to build assets and these elements to their lives. And I hope to share a story an upcoming podcast about my sister and how she's building assets in these areas of her life. I first have to ask her if she's interested in sharing those, but I think there's some really cool stories that she can share. So think about that. And then if you're in an organization or you lead an organization, you have a voice in an organization, thinking about if you had that blank piece of paper or that blank slate, blank canvas, how would you really want to deliver services to the people that you support? And what would that look like? And taking an approach that Patti took of thinking about what are those values that you would like to have for your organization, and how would that be different from how you currently support organizations? And Patti and Dave would be happy to help you think through this type of thinking, and I'd be more than happy to help you think through it from a coach perspective and a business model perspective as well. So feel free to reach out to any of us to start to walk through that type of thinking. Now, next week, excited about the guest that we have coming on. It's her name is Dr. Anik Jansen, and she resides in New Zealand. And in a previous episode, we had Melissa Jansen, her daughter, come on, and we talked about siblings. And Dr. Anik Jansen has really taken that blank canvas thinking and applied it to the experience of families where there's a son or a daughter with a disability, and thinking about what would be the best experience for families as they start to go through interacting with service providers and finding the vision or the dream for their families. And Dr. Anik Jansen really has some great experience with this, and she's done a lot of thinking around it, and excited to bring that to you. She's going to share a course that she's put together and built and piloted across Australia and I believe New Zealand as well, and also a game. So we're going to have a fun conversation and share some fun insights with you with Dr. Anik Jansen next week. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. If you like this episode and you think you know someone that would benefit, please share it with them. Be a part of the change to think differently about disability.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. Visit us at empoweringability.org for more podcasts and resources to help you and your loved ones impacted by disability build a full and meaningful life.